Welcome everybody to the PlantLab Symposium. I'm very, very glad that you have decided to come along. I'm going to be talking a little bit about PlantLab in a moment, but I'd like to start just with a small acknowledgement of place. So if we could just take a moment to center ourselves, and I would like to send a thanks to the spirits of this place who have allowed us to do our work. To all the beings, including the plants of Te Tai Tokerau and the ancestors who support us in our practice. I would like all those who attend to gain as much as possible from our work, and also the land itself to be benefited by our practice. I ask for grace and goodwill and kindness in our knowledge sharing today, which we give very generously to our community, and hope that those who are participating share in return some wonderful questions so we can support you and engage with you as well. So blessings to everybody, and I'd like to begin. So an acknowledgement to start for New Zealand TechWeek, which this is part of. The TechWeek program is really wonderful, and it is a way that we can showcase all the wonderful innovation that's happening in our region. So New Zealand Tech have supported this particular webinar and Zoom, and our project PlantLab is actually a Ministry of Culture and Heritage funded project, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So welcome to Alex, Kim, Nick, I think it might be Paul, and Warren, who have joined us already. So if you have any questions, any of you, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll attend to them as we go along. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I have a presentation to go through with you about PlantLab and the kaupapa behind it. If you have questions, put them in and I'll answer them as we go, but probably a little bit more at the end, and we'll begin. Okay, now I'm hoping that all of you can see a presentation right now. And I'm going to just check that's the case by going back into Zoom. Oops. Can I get someone in the chat just to confirm that you can see my screen at the moment, please? Just a little kind of, hey, hello.
Yeah, we can see it.
Thank you, Kim. Yay, thank you. You know when you do Zoom and you're like, I'm talking. Okay, we're there. Right, give me a sec. Okay. So, PlantLab, we're going to start with a little bit about me, why we're doing PlantLab, and a little bit of the theory behind it, because there is some reasons that we're doing it, and some kind of clear kaupapa that I've been working with for a long time now around practice and place-based practice and cross-disciplinary practice. And then round about 11 o'clock, if not before, we're going to have some presentations from the crew who are in PlantLab, some mini presentations about what they're doing, and some opportunities to ask some questions then. We'll have a couple of breaks as we go along, and we're intending to finish around 12 o'clock. So to start with, I want to say that my practice is about portals, parallel universes, and alternative realities. And so that is pause for some people, but essentially for about 30 years now, I've been interested in how to get people together to think differently, both about themselves, the places they live, and the communities that they work and engage with. And I've been doing that in New Zealand, but I've also been doing that overseas and in places like Africa and rural Scotland. And I guess that practice up until, I guess, 15 years ago has been about how people see the world and how we can change the way they see the world. For a long time, I realized that simply doing what we were doing before, or doing what I was doing before, wasn't working so well, that the problems that we face, like climate change and various other things in the world, were kind of being studied and engaged with the same mindset that in a way created them, which is quite siloed. And so for a long time, I would be working across silos to get organizations talking better, communities talking better, and in fact, people talking more openly with themselves and building some self-awareness. And about 15 years ago, I started looking into other ways that I could do that practice, and particularly looking at technologies and leading edge ideas and methods. I was working with a group in Brussels at the time called FOAM. So if any of you are online and want to look them up, that's fo.am. And they're a cross-disciplinary group with scientists and artists and so forth. We're really thinking outside the box. And it was them that pushed me out of doing mainstream strategic consulting, participative research, into thinking more about how I can bring in my spiritual practice and my creative practice and integrate those into my work. Through FOAM, I was given a grant to do some work around alternate reality gaming, which is a gaming platform where you play in the real world and also online and mix between realities. And I then came back to New Zealand and started working in that area. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But essentially, my work is around portals and getting people from different realities to collaborate. And when we see the term transdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary, and some of you would have seen that when you went into the seminar, you'll have seen that you know, you'd be wondering, what does those terms mean? What are the what is that sort of, you know, that kind of what do you call it, jargon, if you like? I think for me, I use the term cross-disciplinary, but most oftentimes I describe myself as a transdisciplinary practitioner, and I would describe PlantLab as a transdisciplinary project. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But as I said before, I've worked in strategic community development. I've also worked as a lecturer in universities, and obviously I had my PhD in a university, which was a cross, I would say, transdisciplinary PhD. And actually, knowledge is very difficult to share. That's my summary of it. It's getting better as technology has advanced, as people are becoming aware that we need to share across boundaries. You know, that's really important. But actually, fundamentally, where most knowledge is generated is either in community through practice. And some of you who have joined us today will be practitioners. You have your own knowledge that you have. Some of you will also be academics, perhaps, or you've done study at some time, and you'll realize that you were in a faculty, in a department. And if any of you have been in a university, or let's say any kind of tertiary education setting, you'll realize that departments don't often very easily share knowledge or collaborate across boundaries, essentially. That's for funding reasons. It's also to do with the way that that academics are promoted through oftentimes processes where publications in quite niche journals are valued over ones that are more cross-disciplinary. So the system conspires to make knowledge difficult. And if you're a community person, you'll know that trying to access information or knowledge that's been generated in academia is actually quite hard. I mean, there are some journals, and some of you can ask a little bit later if you're interested, that are more open source than others, and you can through your library access information. But generally speaking, most knowledge is paywalled, or it's got a non-disclosure agreement associated with it if it's generated within a corporate. So I guess I've always been about radical sharing, about people being open about knowledge, but also more fundamentally how to share knowledge again across those alternative worlds or parallel realities. Some people use the term interdisciplinary to describe their practice, or multidisciplinary teams. For me, those tend to be still working within disciplinary boundaries, but maybe crossing some knowledge over. Transdisciplinary is most often defined as a practice where you move across boundaries, but also move beyond them into something other than the discipline themselves. And if you look at someone like Niculescu, who's one of the leading thinkers on that, and I can provide a reference to that later. In fact, I think I might have one here. Yes. You'll see that Niculescu talks about transdisciplinarity as being between the disciplines, across the different disciplines, and beyond all disciplines. And then you'll also see there's something there from Petzo and Bukele around more than the sum of the parts. I think people like Niculescu would also add that transdisciplinary moves beyond disciplines into something that also involves other ways of thinking. So within his point of view, and particularly my practice, it would involve other ways of knowing the world, particularly Indigenous ways of knowing the world, or creative practice ways of knowing the world that sit well outside often what academia really validates. So in terms of places, my practice and PlantLab itself is a place-based initiative or place-based practice. And it's the reason for that, or the reason that it's supporting place, is that if it's place focused, and I think that's doable for people, it allows them to connect, not just from a head point of view, but also from their heart in many cases. And also most issues that we have in the world are essentially issues of place. If you look at some of the things that are happening around climate change, for example, or deforestation or biodiversity issues, when it comes down to it, they're fundamentally issues that are place and impacting place and community. And often those communities are the ones who are the subject of research. They're not the ones who are generating the research. So I guess my practice is how do we change that a little bit? When you're dealing with place, what you're dealing with is a very diverse knowledge point. So in places, you have people who have memories of those places, you have scientists who study the soil, you have oral historians, etc. And I'll tell you a little bit about a project where I engaged all of those as a transdisciplinary project. But essentially places are contested points of knowledge as well. There might be places that have been colonized. There might be places that have multiple histories sitting side by side. And quite often when people study places, they don't actually account for that. For example, let's take a snapshot of Amazonia or the rainforest and the Amazon. There are multiple projects from universities in there at the moment studying the effects of on climate change of deforestation practices, and those might be from economics departments through to biology and climatology areas. But I guess only a few of them are engaging in partnership with Indigenous peoples in that area. And I also, in that practice, kind of different other points of view that might come from a creative point of view are often not partnered directly with those projects. There are some that do that, but not always. So I think it's how do you find a way to engage all those ideas? Because if you've got complex, intractable issues, for me, studying them within the same mindset that created them, which is siloed, is problematic. We need to get outside of that and actually start looking at these issues in a way that's holistic, inclusive, and brings in all sorts of different ideas. And that's where, for me, innovation happens. Now, I'm just going to take a pause and stop sharing for a sec, if I can do this without having a major thing. Are there any questions just at the moment? Anyone have any questions? Is that clear so far? Any comments or anything like that, just in case I've been talking to myself this whole time and you haven't seen anything? So far, so clear? Quick hand raise or a yes, just to let me know you're out there. Thank you. Thank you, Warren and Kim and Paul. I can see you all there. Thank you. So let's get back into it again. So for me, given that my practice has always been place-based, even when I was doing quite, I guess, strategic consulting or development consulting in different nations, it's always been inherently a place-based practice, and it's always for me been a spiritual practice. And I'm very clear and overt about talking about that. I think sometimes people find that challenging, but if we're going to engage and do something different, then we need to own all the parts of ourselves and all the way that we know the world. So for me, a spiritual practice involves a kind of earth-based practice, and it's kind of a very sort of pragmatic, how do I be of service to the world without a particular faith attached to it. But in that practice, I guess for me, I'm thinking about the spirits of place. How do I support that? And you'll see some projects as we go along. It's not just about, okay, how do we solve some of the issues of, poisoning or deforestation or biodiversity or pest control, etc. It's like, how do we support the spirits of these larger places? And how do we collaborate with them as if they are sentient and that they have an engaged stakeholder relationship, rather than how do I objectively study these objects at a distance, i.e. trees. So one of the things I think that has happened over the last several hundred years is that we've moved from a place-based practice that is inherently inspirited and a way of knowing the world where intrinsically our identity is related to the world. And I'm talking about people from all cultures. We've moved from that to, first of all, the world that we live in is not inspirited. The inspirited nature of it is kind of defined within certain faiths and within certain rituals. And secondly, at a certain point, with the scientific rational material point of view, we got to a point where it wasn't actually okay to talk about the spirit of place. And Ralph's quote here, Ralph is a great person around place, if any of you are interested. Ralph's talking here about with the progress of civilization, it went from a kind of spirit of place to a kind of quite secular meaning. So now when we talk about spirit of place, people often use the word sense of place. If they use spirit of place at all, it will be like an architect talking about built forms, for example, oftentimes in academic research. For me, I'm interested in a really progressive understanding of the spirit of place. I'm interested in how we can see place not only as inspirited, but also the fact that we have code, we have technology, we have signals embedded in our environment now. And as I talk a little bit later about augmented reality and some of the things I've been doing with that, there are multiple ways that we experience reality at any given time. We can have different skins within a moment, different identities. We can live in different realities at the same time. And I'm sure some of you may be in different realities engaging in multitasking, which is completely fine by me as you listen to this. So with that ability, I think oftentimes people put technology aside from the spirit of place and think, okay, well, that's not really a spiritual thing or something that isn't part of the environment. It's an imposition on the environment. And for me, I feel like we've got beyond that point because at any given time, we will have signals and code surrounding us. So my point of view is that that's part of the ecology. And so in terms of PlantLab, when we come to a little bit later, you'll see that I'm thinking about PlantLab as something that's all encompassing as an ecology. It's practice and research from not only different kinds of disciplines in different kinds of mediums, but also different kinds of ways of seeing the world that may or may not for that person include some form of technology or signal or code. And then just in terms of the last bit of jargony type stuff to barrel you with, one of the key themes of the work that I do is around heterotopia, and it's a term that Foucault particularly came up with, and without getting all the ins and outs and going into French philosophy, the nature of heterotopic places or heterotopia are that they're sort of other places, and other places where those who are outside the mainstream often congregate, or they're places where multiple histories are juggled or placed together or juxtaposed. They're people who are less productive will be in heterotopia. I grew up very close to a mental health facility way out in the country when I was growing up because my parents worked there. That would have been considered heterotopic. But we might also consider using, for example, a mobile phone to see augmented creatures like Pokemon a few years ago, kind of those sites being heterotopic, where the creatures were, but they were sort of sites with multiple realities clashing at once. You could also argue that some of the sites that we have that are colonized, in fact, most places in New Zealand, are heterotopic in that they're contested. So I think it's an idea that I'm working with, and I'm imagining that when we do the PlantLab installation, which I'll talk about a little later, that will be a heterotopic site in some way. So those are the key themes of what we're working with. So in terms of practice, I want to talk a little bit about transdisciplinary practice, and then I want to show you how I've kind of come to the point of engaging and creating PlantLab, because there is kind of a history of practice behind it. First of all, Awhi World, which is the name of one of my companies, but also the name of a project. Awhi World was the project that I was funded by Foam to come and do in New Zealand. It was actually a Culture 2000 grant by the European Commission. And I looked at alternate reality gaming, and I was interested in how you could use alternate reality gaming, or that multi-platform, multi-reality gaming, to instigate change in communities. And so I worked with a community that I lived in Papakura at a primary school. And in the school, we introduced theatre, gaming elements, and all sorts of different mediums and disciplines to teach the children over 3 months about a parallel reality that they were essentially immersed in. So we had the local police pull up with interdimensional, in those days it was a CD that we put in a CD player, and we had someone with their voice booming out, giving us a message from beyond. Then they went back to their classrooms and they discovered all these clues in their classrooms. And then for 3 months, essentially, they used math skills, social studies, print and art skills to discover the reality. And I had a series of actors appear through portals to give talks about sustainability and the environment. We did a CSI whiz around the school to find portals. So we had these portal packs, and the kids found things that looked like portals around the school. And then as part of that process, they then learned about the nature of what reality is, and also the nature of their neighbourhood and connected to place. So that was, I guess, the first real transdisciplinary project, because it had those elements of partnering with mana whenua in that instance, partnering with artists, and all those different disciplines and mediums that were involved to create something that's very hard to describe, except for the fact that it's a hyphen, it's a curriculum development / game / community development event. And I think when you get to the point where you've got those different hyphens, you're probably in the territory of working in transdisciplinary practice. During my PhD, I also did, one of my case studies was quite a very clearly transdisciplinary process. That was an investigation of a park in Papakura, and as part of the investigation, I worked alongside scientists, soil biologists, as well as microbiologists. I worked with a drone. In those days, they were octocopters that were enormous and would take your head off if you got near them. I strapped my mobile phone to it because we couldn't find a way of getting it on there. So we zoomed my mobile phone around the lake as it was, which was very disconcerting. I also did lots of videography using different kinds of attachment to my phone, including microscopes and so forth. And also then researched in archives around New Zealand the history of that location, did lots of oral history with people who had ties to that site, and also worked with a number of different other people, mana whenua, local iwi, local psychics, various people who would have a way in to discuss and think about the different other ways of knowing that site. And once I had all that material, I used a VJ program called Resolume and went around the site in 7 different locations and actually intuitively live mixed all of that data which I had input, including letters and sound files, etc. And that content then came up as kind of layered experiences. As you can see here, this is my brain waves. I used a portable ECG set to record my brain waves around the site. This is a bone that I discovered on the site, which turned out to be a cow bone, but I won't go into the drama of what happened before we thought it was a cow bone. And that's, I think, some lichen from one of the trees overlaid. This is a daisy that I photographed, and this is a letter from a young woman who wanted to see if she could graze her horse in 1972, which I overlaid together. Once I'd overlaid all those different sites on 7 different spots, I then created a geolocative app, and then people could go to the site, put on their headphones and go to these 7 sites, and the GPS would locate them there and then play this data back to them. So they had an immersive experience of the data played back. And for me, that was the first, I guess, truly transdisciplinary project that I'd used AR, augmented reality, with, where it was about giving back something to the spirit of that place, getting people to see the place with new eyes, but also thinking about how one engages and change, kind of challenges the way that data is formed. I mean, I could have done like a standard kind of storytelling app where you just kind of walk around the site, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted people to get the information quite laterally. And this one, by the way, is these are the amounts of money that were given to claimants who actually the land was taken from just after the Settlement Act in New Zealand. It's overlaid on some steps in a nearby site. And so this site that we worked on was not only a wahutapu site, it was a contested site. So it was in terms of colonisation. So it was really important, and it's important to all my practice to work closely with whoever the iwi or hapu or iwis and hapu that are in the area, to make sure that they're on board with what I'm doing and that the spirits are aligned with it. So everything I did had blessings, literally, and I was in close contact with my practice. I'm going to stop for a second, just check if there's any questions. In fact, I think I can probably see the chat if I go up here. No open questions. So far, so good. Hand raised, just let me know that you're alive out there and that I haven't bored you silly so far. Thank you, appreciate it. You know, when you do Zoom, it's really helpful to do that, right? Especially if you're sharing screen. Thank you very much. So the, whoops. I'll just go, yeah, that's it. So, so part of my PhD drove my supervisors mad. And if any of you are thinking of doing a PhD, I'm more than happy to chat to you about that process, because trying to do a PhD that sits across many disciplines is very problematic for universities. You're like a troublemaker from day one. So my PhD involved augmented reality and geolocative reality. It involved tricksters, which are an archetype that is found in many different cultures around the world. And it involved the spirit of place and the notion of spirit of place and how different people see it, including my own version of it. And the disciplines that I engaged with included computer science, they included human geography, anthropology, philosophy, theology, and education, among others. So let's just say it was hard, but at the end I passed with no amendments, so ha-ha to the supervisors who didn't think I'd make it. But one of the core things about my PhD was that I've always been very, very fascinated in portals and as you've seen, in alternative realities or parallel realities. And after I moved out of working with Awhi World in terms of alternate reality gaming, which I encourage you to look at, by the way, if any of you are creatives or working in communities, it's such a fascinating form that I don't think is used very, still isn't utilised fully. I moved out of that into working with augmented reality. And here's an example of that. These are some little portals that have been made, drawn, and when you hold the iPad over it, as you see here, sound played in this instant, but it could have also been graphics. So AR is essentially a digital overlay on everyday reality that you usually use a mobile device or nowadays goggles to see. For me, augmented reality is quite broad as well. I do a lot of projection mapping with my partner Kim, which is also a form of augmenting sites. We also, again with Kim's help, use sensors and sound, triggered sound and so forth in different locations. Again, for me, that's a form of augmentation. So it's kind of making a layer of digitality on the site with the idea always to support that site. So here's just a quick view of some of the projects where that, again, that transdisciplinary practice was in the process of forming. This is a project with Papakura Marae where we created a prototype map that allowed people to see stories located on the site. And you could walk around and see these floating, and when you stood on the different sites or pressed a button, you could actually hear the stories or see the stories around the location. Play Stories Matariki was another Papakura-based project. That was a project that involved a geolocative app and sound installation. And you could walk around wayfinding different sites, but also could listen, because you could hear faintly when you were in a sound room, different things walk towards it. And then when you got in a very particular GPS location, you'd be in immersive sound essentially. So I curated 7 different artists in 7 different sites. I love the number 7, including underground punk feminists who did a digital overlay on a new gentrified apartment building where they used to wag and play Space Invaders. So that's the little thing, that little blue thing you see in the top corner. So that was like a punk riff that you heard just outside the site, which I thought was kind of nice and subversive. There were also contemporary Māori poets, mana whenua jazz artists, someone from Tupelo, I think, who sung a waiata, Korowai weavers who sung their weaving song, and also somebody who did sacred sound, who was a carver / sound artist. All of them chose the sites or were matched to a site, and the sounds were created for the site. And usually the sites needed some love. They were alleyways or kind of maybe some lost history had happened in the case of the flats. So it was kind of a way of working around this town. So the hyphens were community development, artistic project, and it was also, I guess, a diversity project in terms of curating those different points of view to be together in the same place. Paki Harrison's son, Fred Harrison, was the one who did the little portals, by the way, and was part of the sound project. And he's interested in sacred geometry and sound, and very interesting guy if you look him up. And we also had an exhibition in a local gallery that had these portals from Fred, and you could hold your phone over it and hear it. Because it was also important about supporting the place, it meant that it needed to be accessible. And at the time we were doing it, not a good portion of people had the technology to really fully hear the immersive sound. And also some people have data issues. So there's lots of things to consider with the stuff. So you could just go in the gallery and hear the sounds as well. I've also done transdisciplinary projects in rest homes. This was an augmented reality project we did with the residents, where they created augmented reality objects and then sewed it into things, and then had a wearable arts competition. I'm super interested in, I guess, a view of transdisciplinary practice that is inherently political, insofar as it engages with those who don't have voice or have rank issues compared to others. And I think one of the biggest areas I'm a big advocate of is inclusivity around elderly people. We often think we need to be inclusive around youth, but actually my experience is that youth are very included and actually are pretty blasé about a lot of the practice we do. Elderly people are often excluded and often made to catch up whether they like it or not. And so they get leading edge or immersive stuff a little later than everybody else. And when they're in heterotopic locations like rest homes, or rest home hospitals particularly, they're set outside everyday life, so it's even harder for them to access technologies or leading edge ideas and so forth. So a lot of the work I did, particularly because my mum was in that rest home, was about opening those doors for them. Here's a little augmented reality flower that popped out, and we had the residents record sounds for the flowers, which I have to say is some of the more disturbing sounds they came up with I've ever heard. Those people were very creative. I still have the sounds, and it sticks in my mind sometimes. And then another project, this is my partner Kim, just to give him his kudos. That's a creature you can see through a phone, but not with your everyday eyes. Was a project called Arfi Creatures, which was another AR project, again, community building, business association partnership, art project, digital literacy project, and a project to support local youth. The local youth coloured in the creatures, and they appeared in different sites around the town. And when we did a treasure hunt with the Historical Society / museum, and they had to learn about the town and find the creatures by doing a treasure hunt, learning about the history. So there was a lot of different layers to that. And here are some of the creatures you could find around the town. This was in the chiropractor's office. The chiropractor really went to town with the display for spring, involving this butterfly you see in the bottom right here actually is the augmented one, and it flew around inside when you held your phone over it. And also the skeletons waved at you, which I thought was a lovely thing. It turned into a real skeletal augmented installation thing. And then getting towards the end, another AR project. We've done one of these with a school here in Whangarei, and we did one with Drury, where kids selected places around the school that they loved, created digital content for that, and then we worked with them to create an augmented reality app, so that when you held the app around it on a trail that the kids, little other kids around, you heard stories and poems about why they loved those places. And so there were some butterflies and other creatures. This one, when you held your phone over it, went shh, because it was just outside the library. And another one, this one's a project that involves augmented sound, and it involved sensors. This was a physical regeneration project. This was a derelict tower in Nathan Homestead in Maunarewa. And we collected sounds from around the community and placed them in an audio exciter, which is a kind of piece of technology that creates a speaker out of anything you place it on. So when you went through the bush, you first of all triggered some sounds, and then when you stood next to the tower, whispers and sounds from the community came out. And we worked alongside recreational services to kind of redo the pathways and rejuvenate the tower. And it was like the spirit of the town reconnected the tower, and then the tower amplified that back out again. That was, I guess, some of the work around that. So now we come into PlantLab. There's been a few versions of labs in Whangarei so far. Some of you may remember StrandLab, which was in an empty shop in the Strand Arcade a couple of years ago. That was a pop-up installation, but also innovation lab, where we got the key in that case and then simply set up an installation as we went along to see what would happen. And we had a series of workshops, industry and students, for example, from North Tech together doing green stream workshops. We had someone from Mozilla giving a talk about user experience. We also had a series of different kinds of installed works. So it just evolved as it went along. That was for a month. And another version of that was a smaller version during Fringe a couple of years ago called Fringe Lab. We set up shop and had various kinds of things like 3D printing, workshops and talks and so forth. Again, just seeing what happened once we got the key. So I guess PlantLab forms out of those, first of all, my practice around bringing those worlds together, but secondly, these ideas of labs and pop-ups. So PlantLab started in last year. I was very lucky to get some funding from Ministry of Culture and Heritage to run an event, physical event. And I worked within the bounds of that funding to create some online, I guess you could call them marketing opportunities for it, which is what this is. But the end result is actually a physical installation, which will happen in August, but most likely September. We're just working on the dates at the moment. And that'll be in a CBD location in town. So these are the people who are in PlantLab at the moment. And you're going to hear from them very soon, and they'll introduce themselves. There's Jade in the top left, and underneath Fiona Morgan. We have Kelly Kahukiwa, who isn't able to make us today, who's a sound artist, sound researcher, taonga kōrero expert. Underneath them, we have Alan Thomas, you'll hear from today, myself above him. We'll hear from Tracy Wilms-Dean, who's there with the lovely peacock feathers. Up above, we have, next up the top, we have Tracy M. Benson, Dr. Benson actually. She's actually someone who's working in Australia and is in a trans-Tasman node. She's living a little island in Brisbane, and she's going to be doing some work across the Tasman to link to us here in Te Tai Tokerau later. My partner Kim, who's unable to make it today, in the top right, and then down below the Tonga, who is the partner of Ellen, and they're working on a project together. And again, as I said, you'll be hearing a little bit more from some of those people as we talk through PlantLab. So I'm just stopping the sharing now, and I'm just going to ask, is there any comments or questions about so far? We've got a little bit of time because we're starting the next session at 11, but I'm just wondering, has anyone anything to say, any particular questions about any of the practice that I've mentioned? And it can be from some of the panelists that we've got here, who are the people who are going to be talking next. Just waiting for comments. Everybody's still alive?
Yes, hey, I've got a question or a comment inviting you to talk a bit more about it. This is Alan Thomas, by the way.
Thank you.
You talked about knowledge and the sharing of knowledge, the idea of silos that have emerged, and then how one breaks down these boundaries between disciplines and create this transdisciplinary sort of space. What I'm interested in is the sense of what underlies any knowledge. Having a science background myself and having worked in those kind of areas, you can read, for instance, the headline on a scientific paper. That kind of makes you think you understand what's going on, but actually underlying that is a massive amount of information. And what you're actually seeing is the tip of the iceberg. And I've always found it interesting in sharing knowledge, the sense to which you need to carry the rest of that body with that sharing. So there's a superficial sense of understanding something, and then there's that deeper sense. And I'm really enjoying the engagement in this kind of space where you get the time to absorb some of those deeper knowledges.
Yeah, and I think that points to the fact that what you've already said is that knowledge these days, I think particularly it's dangerous insofar as a Facebook post for people is kind of, that's with the extent of where they're going in terms of where their information is or their knowledge. And so in a society where we're constantly, or many of us are on the run, we're snapshotting quite a lot of info or grabs of content. But actually knowledge comes out of, and people like Foucault and various others, particularly post-structuralists and postmodernists, comes out of an entire culture. I mean, even science itself is a culture that's formed over time. Academia is a culture, social science is a culture. I mean, if you walk into a cultural studies department, that's going to be different than walking into a human geography department. They all have their own cultures and their own ways in which they study, transmit and validate knowledge. And I think the validate knowledge is probably some of the more problematic area for me, Ellen, because oftentimes what happens is that one knowledge system believes itself to be more valid than another. The most classic example of that being Eurocentric colonization, for example, or another example of that would be oftentimes, with respect, some of the harder science disciplines and the way that they consider some of the other departments. They're considered soft options, or that the knowledge isn't as rigorous, etc., etc. And that's a lot to do with the knowledge system. So I guess I'm interested in how we validate knowledge within our own systems rather than impose that validation on others, and also in relationship with each other, learn about some of those deeper ways that we see the world, so that we understand it's not just a sharing of content, it's actually a sharing of a way of being in the world and seeing the world. And I think for me, the best kind of cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary or even just interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary teamwork is where you get beyond people just doing a PowerPoint and flicking a paper across to each other, where you actually start to understand how each person understands knowledge to be, and how they understand knowledge to be itself, or being in the world. So I hate to use the word, because it's a bit problematic for people, but epistemology and ontology. If people can start to understand how we view the world, and that often will only happen through relationship, not just through reading a paper about it, although that helps, then for me, we start to then get into the real point where innovation can happen, because we're actually then seeing and synergizing much content at a much deeper level. Is that a response that makes sense? I guess I just blathered a little bit, but do you see what I mean?
Well, I do see what you mean, and I agree very much. And I mean, sort of Carla Rovelli looking at some of the more sort of profound elements, perhaps, of quantum theory. Would certainly say that everything is relational. It's like nothing can actually exist in an isolated state. It only exists in relation to other things. And I think that's part of what I'm certainly experiencing in this kind of environment as well.
Yeah, and we'll hear a little bit more about your practice in a minute, because Kim, you've got your hand up. Are you wanting to, do you want to just note in the chat if you actually want to ask a question? No? Okay, your hand is down, so I'm presuming not. So we've got time to ask some more questions anyway. What's going to happen in a moment is we're going to take a bit of a break. I'm going to get my voice back, and we're going to come back just before 11 o'clock. And then we're going to hear from some of the people who are working in PlantLab and hear a little snippet of each of their research. And then there'll be time to discuss more about how it is in terms of hearing those different points of view, because the people that you're about to hear from come from, in themselves, they have several disciplines that they work within, or several knowledge systems, I guess, that they work within at the same time. So thank you for sharing and being here so far. And we're now going to take a break, and we're going to come back just before 11 o'clock.